Hi everyone, welcome back to the 21 and Sensory podcast with me, Emily. Today I have special guest Professor Janet Harbord on the show. Janet is a professor of film studies at Queen Mary University of London. Recently she has worked as a principal investigator alongside Stephen Eastwood on a 6-year Wellcome Trust funded project called Autism Through Cinema. Autism Through Cinema was a collaborative investigation into the relationships between neurodivergent thinking and cinematic creation. Through the formation of a collective of autistic filmmakers, a reimagining of medical films, and an exploratory podcast, the project sought out the rich interactions of autistic experiences with the moving image. Janet is on today's episode to chat about her work directing a video essay called Autism Plays Itself, where she asks how films made in clinical settings have contributed to how autism has been medically imagined and defined across the past 70 years. Janet takes one such clinical film and works in collaboration with autistic respondents. I'm really excited to chat to Janet about her work, and would you like to say hello?
Hi. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be discussing the film with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that trying to find a time to both record, but we managed it. And I'm really excited to chat to you about it. I have very kindly been given access to the film, so I have watched it. I did make notes. So maybe you could give us a bit of kind of background as to how this kind of video essay came about, and then maybe we could talk more about kind of directing it.
Yeah, sure. So the project was thinking about the relationship between autism and cinema, not so much in terms of the content of things like Rain Man, for example, which have become real fixed stereotypes, but in terms of how cinema in lots of different ways has shaped our experience of autism, and particularly around the affinities of the form of film. So how does film work in terms of close-ups, editing, repetitions, patterns? So those sorts of things were our focus rather than character-driven narratives. And my particular angle on this was looking at the history of medical films. And I was working with the historian Bonnie Evans, who has written a fabulous book about the history of autism, called The Metamorphosis of Autism. And she had identified a film from 1957 as the first mention of autism in a clinical setting, in a clinical film. Mm-hmm. And so we did a lot more work around archives, and we didn't find anything earlier than that. So that film became incredibly important. It's a 30-minute film. It's a silent film shot at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. It's shot in the children's unit, which was quite a small new unit in the 1950s, where the purpose was to observe children, to try and sort of hone different diagnostic categories, classifications. And the way in which they were doing that, we can see in the film, is to isolate certain, what they would call symptoms, and record those and create intertitle cards with the medical explanation that came before and after the short clip. So the original film is 30 minutes long, as I say, and a third of that is sort of medical explanations of what we're seeing, the children's behaviour and medical interpretations. And it's a really difficult film to watch. And Bonnie and I were both presenting at conferences with showing extracts from films, and people were saying to us, actually it's a bit traumatic watching these children. They look so unhappy. And we also were doing some workshops with Project Artworks in Hastings. Project Artworks is an arts organisation working with people with complex needs. And the workshops we did there, we invited autistic people to come in and view a selection of film extracts. And we had a range of things like Buster Keaton. We had some quite cool entertainment films to sort of entice people. And interspersed between that, we had kind of these pretty awful medical films. And what we noticed is that people just avoided them. No one wanted to go near them. There was no recognition from the autistic people who we were there with that these children had anything in common with them. So really we spent, a year or two getting nowhere with this, and I was almost sort of abandoning the idea that there was anything worth saying about medical film other than quite a dry academic way to quite a small academic audience. And then I worked on a podcast with a group of autistic people, and we developed that during COVID. We became quite close. We had an audience who were writing into us and saying, "Oh, this reminds me of this film. I'd really love to come on your podcast and talk about it." And so we did. And so we sort of built this audience around Autism Through Cinema, and I began to kind of test out some ideas with those people. And I was thinking, actually, I wonder, now that I have established relationships with people, I wonder what they would, whether they'd be prepared to have a look at this film and see if they can interpret what the children are doing, see if they can speculate, free associate, whether they have any identification with these children. And so that's what happened. And of course, we had to do risk assessments first. The last thing I wanted to do was traumatize people. But all three participants decided not to see the film in advance. So I gave them a kind of, a bunch of trigger warning type descriptions of some of the things that are in the film. And I recorded with each of them individually in a studio in Soho last summer.
And that was the first time they'd seen it?
And that was the first time they'd seen it.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That's
Ashlow,
interesting.
yeah, it was. And it felt quite intense, sitting next to people where they were watching these images of these children. I should say that actually, I'd removed the medical intertitle cards. So there was no medical descriptions, just the short extracts of children in a children's unit. So you see the children doing things like playing with sand, being offered sweets, being given milk, and then things being taken away from them, sort of slight provocations. And then also just recordings of children who are ticking in various ways and stimming. So a range of different sort of quite disjointed sorts of behaviours and scenarios that we get to see. So that's the background to what we did. Do you want me to kind of carry on describing how we worked in the studio?
I think it'd be interesting to know kind of how, from kind of start to finish, how long did you spend on this kind of, crafting this video essay from the very start as well? That would be interesting to know.
Sure. So, well, I had the idea for it several years ago as it sort of generally evolved through the project, but we actually made the film in quite a short amount of time. So we recorded in May and June last year. So I worked with each participant separately. And we were in the studio for about 3 or 4 hours, taking lots of breaks, having a breakout space with the studio, trying to take it quite carefully, quite easily with each of them. And I think in some moments it was quite hard for them to watch some of the images in the films, and some of the responses were quite emphatic, quite sort of speaking back to the film, like don't do that to that child, that sort of sense, but also quite a lot of witty, insightful comments about the people who were making the film, or the nurses that you see in the background, kind of shady figures. But more than anything, a really, really high level of identification with the liveliness and sort of life force of these children, and descriptions and interpretations of what the children are doing and thinking and seeing, that just opened it up for me as someone who isn't autistic. The film just blossomed into this completely different thing, where I could see the children as individuals for the first time and outside of this institutional framework. Yeah. So it was a really sort of moving experience. I think it was incredibly rewarding, and also it it just flowed, which was quite extraordinary. Each of the participants had a very different take. Ash Lloyden, who is a graphic designer, artist, he had a very sort of engaged response to the film, thinking about his own children and thinking about how diagnosis takes place and how diagnostic categories overlook the cleverness that is there in children's behavior. So he was very good at identifying, in fact, how smart the children were and how this was not being picked up on in the hospital at all, but being ticked off as some sort of pathology. There's Sophie Broadgate, who's a filmmaker, and she was very interested in the rhythms and sort of physical movements and repetitions that the children were involved in all of the time. And her take is that all autistic people are dancers, have a relationship to rhythm and dance sort of naturally. And towards the end of this film, there is a sequence of a girl out in the garden, and it's quite beautiful. And Sophie's glossing of that is really brings it to life. That this girl is sort of communing with the different shrubs and flowers and rocks that we see, and it's very rhythmic. It is like contemporary dance, as she says. And then the third participant was Ethan Lyon, and Ethan had been a student at Queen Mary, so I've known Ethan since about 2013. And Ethan's take was, I think, more critical of the three of them of the hospital context, but very very powerful in his interpretation of what the children wanted, and it also evoked a lot of memories for him in terms of his own diagnosis and his own enjoyment in childhood of lining up toys and things like this. So yeah, that was the experience of being in the studio with each of them. I had Alex Widdowson recording the sound, who is a neurodivergent animator. So he was in the room too. It was just the three of us each time. And I had a lot of material to, get down to about 15, 20 minutes of these three interviews. So I went away thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. This is going to take me a year just to create a paper edit. But in fact, it didn't. It was very intuitive. They each had something very different to offer. And it was really just a question of going for that, going through the material and picking out the differences. And it seemed to me then at that point that I wasn't making a film about interpretations of the past only. I was also making a film about each of them. So that became very significant. I hadn't really understood that before we went to the studio, that in fact this was as much about those three people in the present as it is about those children.
That was really fascinating to kind of hear you break it down more, because kind of like you say, like I've just seen the kind of 18 minutes and, not realizing that it was kind of, put to them on the day to kind of talk over this. And yeah, you kind of think that if you're spending 3 to 4 hours with someone, that would be hard to cut down. But from my kind of point of view, like exactly as you said, they were all had such different kind of reactions, but also like pushback as well as to what was what they were watching. And I think also a lot of listeners might not appreciate that the kind of editing and the sound design and all these like little things that add to this kind of, I don't know, it's uncomfy to watch. It gets more comfortable because you're like, oh, actually, they are kind of being themselves. And I think, I can't remember who said it, but someone said there's just something about the freeness of being autistic that frightens people.
Yes,
that hit me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Ash towards the beginning when we see one boy who has quite exaggerated stimming movements or rocking movements, and he rocks as he moves forward across the room. And that's one of the more difficult images in the film, and I think that his take on that, that it frightens people, but it's a kind of freeness in being and moving, is a beautiful way of putting it, and I think it was important that came quite early in the film.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the things you're talking about, the editing and how to put this together, and one of the issues that we had quite early on, I worked with Sasha Litvin-Saver, who's a fabulous filmmaker, and she's a colleague of mine at Queen Mary. And we had extensive conversations about how we might edit it beforehand. And I was saying to her, the problem that I think we're going to have is that I'm going to have 3 lots of commentary on one short sequence. So the sequences are only about 10, possibly 12 seconds long, at the most about 20 seconds long. And that's really not very long to have someone narrate it, someone make a comment over it. So how are we going to cope with having really long comments and a really short sequence? I mean, either you need to cut to black and hear the voice without the image, or what else, or we slow it down. And so we tried slow motion with it, and slow motion is not something that I'm a fan of. I find whenever you get slow motion in TV or film, it tends to suggest here's a really profound epic moment. It's used very well by a filmmaker like Wong Kar-wai, who has these, this beautiful big soundtrack, and we see someone very melancholic in slow motion walking through a street in Hong Kong looking heartbroken. And it's this great pathos, but it's sort of problematic in a situation like this where it's just so loaded in terms of making something look profound and sort of asking the audience to have this kind of this connection to it where it just felt a bit manipulative. So that was just not going to happen right from the beginning. Like, no, slow motion won't work. So thinking more about the edit, we began to think about the editing as a form of stimming. And could we use editing on loops, just like stimming is a form of looping, and going with, Sophie Broadgate's sense of the children needing feedback. She talks about this a lot in their bodies, what they're doing when they're rocking from foot to foot, or, hand flapping. They are actually getting feedback from the world in a particular way, making the air move, feeling the ground beneath their feet. And so we started to think about editing as enhancing or amplifying what the children were doing. And that's really what the film does. And I hope that works for people. It certainly works for me. I think that it invites a sort of liveliness in our responses, our bodily responses to the children's movements. In the film. And I found myself, one last comment on that, I found myself at night after I watched this footage, like you do when you're looking at edits and you're working with material, you go over and over. I just found myself beginning to mimic what some of the children were doing. And there's particularly one girl in the film whose expression and movement I absolutely love. It's the girl who uses her skirt as a tool, as Ash puts it. So you probably remember this bit too. Yeah. She's sort of towards the middle of the film. She's quite a small blonde child, sits cross-legged on the floor, puts toys in her skirt, and she has this sort of almost like a hiccup. But she's not hiccuping. She's her body sort of lifts up and her eyes move up at the same moment, and her expression is just so joyful and cheeky. And then she moves off and off screen, carrying these toys in her skirt. And I just found myself just wanting to do that movement, rehearse that movement myself. So there's something about the editing and the repetition that sort of was, infectious. It sort of moved me into a space of feeling the rhythms of what the children 70 years ago were doing. And that seemed pretty fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And the way you're saying that the editing is kind of reflective of stimming, I definitely got that through the kind of rhythm of the kind of sound design on top of, how it was edited, but also just kind of through the looping. I felt like each time the kind of loop, reset almost and went back to the start, I'd almost kind of noticed another thing that I don't know, focus on the feet this time, or focus on their facial expression. It gave you more opportunity to watch, I think.
Right. Yes. Yes.
In a good way.
Yeah. That's interesting that you could see more each time you go back to it.
Yeah. And I found myself also, I think there was one point where where someone said like, whoa, 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 like, wait, let's go back, kind of thing, like that expression that one of the children was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I found after I'd watched it kind of through, I went back to that bit because I was like, I wonder if I can see what he sees in it, kind of thing. So
Right.
I found myself going back over it just to see kind of what I could see a second time, sort of thing. So I thought
Mm.
that was quite interesting because I feel like I wouldn't necessarily kind of do that with a video normally. So I was
Yeah.
trying to see what the kind of participants saw.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's one of the sequences from the film that was powerful for all of us. Of a boy sitting on a nurse's lap, looking directly into camera, and he has one of the most sustained looks into the camera, which of course in most filmmaking is taboo. You know, the one thing actors are not meant to do, or even in documentary film, they're meant to be talking to someone, not into the camera. So it's a sort of, it creates a strange moment, but it's a moment in which it looks as though the child might be understanding that he is being recorded, and um, that the camera is doing something that is not just a toy. I think that's kind of what I get from that sequence.
Mhm.
And I think that's when Ethan has that lovely line of, it's the face of someone who's just understood something.
Yeah. Almost
Yeah.
like recognizing that flicker come across someone's face. And that
Yeah.
was the bit I went back to. I was like, can I see that?
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. And also what you said about the girl with the like lovely long skirt. I love just how I don't know how I don't know, her thought pattern was like, I can use this as a tool to to
Yeah.
help me kind of thing. And like you say, that kind of rocking action of getting up and away is
Yes.
quite kind of it's kind of therapeutic to watch, I guess, in that she was you know, kind of full of joy and like happy to get going with everything in her skirt.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's quite, when you think about the context of these children being in this institutional setting, um, they're not just behaving as they would do at home. They're going to be in a place of discomfort, bewilderment, no matter, who they were before they arrived there. And so I think it's very difficult for anyone to look resilient or joyful. And yet some of these children do, which is incredibly sort of touching or
Mm.
moving, that these children have that sense of resilience um, about them. I mean, another thing just to say about the making of the film and the sort of planning of it. So first of all, I was thinking that I would like to try and trace whether any of these people were alive. There's a chance that some of them could have been, or track down some of their relatives.
Mhm.
And it would have been amazing to meet them as, older adults, and get them to reflect on their time at the Maudsley. But no records had been kept, so all of the children were anonymous as far as the research and the archive were concerned. So that would have been a completely different film, and for a while that stymied me. And I was thinking, oh, okay, I'm not going to be able to make an essay film about this. That it would only be an academic interpretation. But then it seemed possible to work it from the present moment instead,
Mhm.
with people who were meeting the film for the first time, and without knowing any of the history of the children.
Mhm. And did you kind of find out more about kind of were the children once they were kind of there, were they kind of like inpatient and kept there until they became adults? Like, what was the kind of, I don't know, the almost sort of history? Were they kind of inpatient for life sort of thing? Or do you think like
Yeah.
how did it work? And if you know
Yeah,
that.
sure. I mean, I think the 50s were, it was a significant decade for um, diagnosis, and for autism in particular. Of course, uh, Asperger and Canna had in 1944 um, staked their claims from written studies, case histories of children in the States and in Vienna. And this hadn't really sort of rooted anywhere particularly. So autism wasn't a kind of concrete diagnostic category. But during the 50s, there was this sort of sifting of behaviours, and autism was under the umbrella of psychosis broadly. So they were trying to narrow this down. And the Maudsley was also trying to establish itself as a research hospital and be taken seriously. And so this film was made by a British psychiatrist called James Elwyn Anthony, who went to the States quite quickly after this. But at this time, he was conducting research in these quite new units of studying children for the study of children. And they weren't kept in, so they weren't institutionalized. This was a decade in which, institutions were being shut down and people were being sort of encouraged to live within communities. And you see in the 60s a sort of push towards filming children in community settings, and different sorts of day centres and educational settings. And films become public information film around sort of trying to educate people around diversity of various sorts. But during the 50s, there's a sort of in between, whether these research centres where children go for the day, they probably would have been attending for several weeks. Their parents are involved in the diagnosis. In one part of the film, you see some parents coming in. You can't tell what they're saying because, of course, it's a silent film and there aren't any intertitles covering that. But you do see a family around one of the children. So it's not it's not a terrible sense of incarceration for these children. Mm-hmm. They're not there for life or anything like that. But they're sort of children for whom there is no context that makes sense for them. And so they're here. People are sort of puzzling. People are putting quite heavy labels on their behaviour. And that's about where we are in 1957. And the film was made in order to compare notes with other psychiatrists on a global scale. So Elwyn Anthony takes this to a conference in Switzerland, a conference that Canna is at, and many other hundreds of psychiatrists there to discuss their research on diagnostic categories. Not all around children, but children are quite an important focus for psychiatric research during that decade.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really helpful because it kind of gives a bit of context, because like me just watching it, I didn't have that kind of background. I was like, oh, are these children like being kept kind of thing? But seeing it from the kind of research perspective, like that makes like much more sense.
Right.
But it was so interesting to me how much was kind of like pushed on the children, but also taken away from the children. Like,
yes.
Just like every other clip, it was like, oh, you need this, or you can't have that. Like, did you feel like you were seeing that quite a lot?
Yes, I did. I think there were real enticements and provocations, some of which completely failed. Children refusing sweets and so forth. Although the refusal of sweets is interpreted in the film as a sort of part of a pathology and a non-engagement with the adults who are offering. One of the comments that doesn't get into the film was Ash saying, so many sweets are offered to children in the course of this film that he says, it's like it's sponsored by the sugar industry. Tate and Lyle's sponsoring of the Maudsley Hospital. I mean, it is quite incredible. And there's that sort of fascination with, childhood, acceptable behaviours around children from earlier times, that it was just fine. It was seen as desirable that you'd entice children with sweets to come and play in the sand, or you'd give them a milk bottle and then take that milk bottle away to see what happened. Mm-hmm. Sort of strange things where you think now, wow, is that okay? Why would you do that? And
yeah.
But there's something quite I don't know what to say about it, but exactly. But I guess I'm trying to think about the way in which it captures that particular moment of the 50s,
Mhm.
that post-war moment where sweets are around. Children are there's mass education. Children are getting milk at school. They're being offered milk here, but there's also a sense of children being quite passive and having to respond to the authority of adults. That's what I get
Mhm.
in the film.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just considering it was an 18 minute film, there's so much like packed in there, I feel, to like then unpack afterwards. And I think like a bit like you saying like you were going over certain bits in your head afterwards. Like I feel like since watching it, you like I just have found myself thinking about it more and trying to like unpick certain bits, which I think is really interesting. And I can definitely kind of, I don't know, just relate to
Mm,
how, I don't know, just the freedom that they feel when they're just left to it
mm,
and allowed to be themselves, kind
yeah.
of like a kind of autistic unmasking sort of thing.
Yes, quite right. That I mean, there are definitely moments in the film like that too, aren't there, where
Mm,
you do see the children behaving in a way where it seems as though they're quite uninhibited.
mhm,
And it's interesting what the different bits of the film stay with you. I think
mm,
it's for me working on it, having seen this film so many times, different bits stay with me in different moments. So it's a bit like you say, going back over and over footage, you see something new, and it sort of gets under your skin
yeah.
in different ways.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I think also, like, I know I've mentioned the sound design as well as the editing, but
Yes.
I'd be interested to know because it was kind of this underlying sort of like
Mm,
track behind, like, obviously the voices were the main kind of focus sound wise, but are you able to explain the kind of thinking behind the sort of background sort of track? It was very kind of like
mm.
like bloops. I don't know how to like digital bloops is what comes to my mind.
Yeah, yes. Well, the sound designer is Tom Fisher, who does a lot of work documenting natural sounds. So he works a lot in landscapes where there's water, um, and oh yeah, all sorts of nature sounds that you wouldn't think that something would make a sound, and like
Mhm.
the kind of the sound of someone walking across lichen, for example, or something like that. Um, so he has a whole range of a sort of archive of sounds that he's collected,
Okay.
and he creates things with them, and that's how he works. And so we had a conversation where I gave him some sort of markers in the film landscape of things that I liked, and one of those things was a film called Scrapbook by a Canadian filmmaker, Mike Hulboom. It's a film that's online if people wanted to find it, um, and it's a film where he uses the footage that an avant-garde filmmaker shot in a children's home um, in the States in the late 60s, and Hulbom makes a film similarly with archive footage, and he has one of the original children going back and responding to herself on film, and he uses these sorts of quite abstract sounds that seem to be tonal. What's the
Mhm.
note here, what's the tone, what's the feel of this image. The child looks quite lost in themselves, so you might strike a particular sound. So that I liked that a lot, but I also liked the way in which Hulbum works with found sound. He uses a lot of sampling of different sounds and moves it together.
Mhm.
So Tom and I ended up working with those ideas, and sometimes with me giving him some words. So, for example, one of the words that was useful for him was the word transmission. And what I meant by that was I wanted something in the sound design to feel as though it's coming from a long time ago. So you have the voices in the contemporary, but I wanted the soundtrack to feel as though there's also a communication from the past, from the 1950s, without using sounds from the 1950s. So he found a lot of sounds that were, sort of like referencing old technologies, or what sound does when it's distorted and comes through different channels of transmission. So that's one example of how we worked. And he also drew on a lot of his own sort of riffs and repetitions of things that he liked from the natural world, which also seemed to fit rather strangely with the institutional setting in which we see the children. So maybe there's something that is kind of referencing a world outside of the institution in the sound design. I don't know. See what other people think of that.
Yeah, I definitely think it kind of pairs really well with the visuals, because I don't know, it kind of follows a sort of kind of rhythm, I feel. And yeah, it's kind of, at one point I was like, oh, it's quite kind of random, but then it seems to kind of like fit what's happening on screen. And it was just, I don't know, the whole sensory experience of watching, I think it added another like layer. I don't know if that makes sense.
yeah, it makes absolute sense. And I think the film can appear so stark, and I think what you're saying is it's a fabulous way of explaining the feel of the film, that there's something that is more layered in there with the voices and the sound design.
Also, I know that the film has been accepted as part of a film festival. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about the background behind that?
Yes, sure. So the film was finished in October 2023. We had a small amount of money for a bit of publicity and producer, but it's very difficult to get short films into festivals. I imagined that this film might just go onto our project website, but in fact it got into a number of festivals. It got into quite a big festival in Toronto Hot Docs, and on a Friday night in May, my phone just wouldn't stop ringing, and I hadn't picked up my emails because I was working on something else at the time, and it turned out that the film had won a big award at this festival of best international short documentary film. So that was just stunning, yes. And immediately I was emailing Ash and Ethan and Sophie, and having to put together an acceptance speech. None of us were there, but emailing that to Toronto for them to read out that night. So that was really wonderful. And then it also got into Krakow Film Festival, and it also has got into the Edinburgh Film Festival. So it's screening there on Monday. I'm not sure when this podcast is going out. So it will be screening on Monday, the 19th of August, or have screened at Edinburgh. And Ash, Sophie, Ethan and I are all going to be there. It's the first time we're going to be watching the film together, and probably in a festival context. And we're also doing the Q&A there, and Ash has designed some fabulous t-shirts for us all to wear, with an image of the little boy who looks into the camera. So that's going to be really exciting and fun. And also the film has a different life, quite curiously. It's going to be on JC Long's show on Radio 4, her program Shortcuts, or it will have been by the time this is broadcast. And it's a show where they use a radio show where they use sound that's already in existence, and they frame it in a particular way. So the theme of this episode is in color, and the idea is that the respondents bring to life this film from a long time ago that's black and white, and sort of give it color and life. And so it's radio. How strange that the film's going to be part of a radio thing, but it is. And there's going to be an AI voice that's describing some of the sequences, and then you hear Ash, Ethan, and Sophie commenting on those sequences. So I'm intrigued as to what that's going to sound like, but that's also fantastic. So the film has this life of its own that I'd never imagined for it, and it's it's been an absolute delight and fabulous for all of us, because it means we get to keep talking and, and thinking about the film and celebrating those children from that long time ago, as well as making something now.
Yeah, and also kind of reframing that into, continued conversations about, what it was like then and what it should be like now, kind of thing. Like, I
Yeah.
think that's, it's really interesting how you've kind of turned it a bit, but also like really fascinating about the radio show. And I'll try and link that if it does kind of come out, and I have the link to it.
Sure.
But I guess people will fill in the visuals, kind of thing, when they hear potentially.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's testament to how powerful the responses were,
Mhm.
that they're so evocative that listening to their descriptions is enough
Mhm.
to make a radio program from. So I mean, it's all credit to Sophie, Ethan, Ash. Their interpretations have just been fantastic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed. I don't know, just sometimes that there was such a range of kind of blunt and witty, and like just
Yes.
there was just such a range of emotion in what they were saying about what was going on. That was really kind of
Yes.
interesting. And at the start it's like, oh, this is a bit uncomfortable to watch, but then the way that they're reframing it, like,
Mm.
this girl is having a great time in the garden, like, if she's just
Yeah.
left to it and just let her be.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think it's also an interesting film for things like social policy, which is perhaps a bit of a dry subject to bring up in this discussion. But it just, there are those debates about what should happen to films like this. They appear online in some contexts that are, just like freak films. There's a whole category, if you Google for long enough, of sort of freakish medical clinical films. No context about how they were made, who these children or adults are, and it's a kind of an argument for it to be taken down and no one to see these films. And I think that a lot of archives are very aware of that,
Mhm.
and so they tend to monitor who has access to these films and ask them what they're going to do with them. But of course, that also limits who's going to get to see them, and it's often people like me, academics, who um, have quite an easy access because of my training. So there's not a middle ground, and I think there was something about making this film that made me think about how this film might be a, a model for how we work with archive films. That maybe archive medical films that are difficult to watch,
Mhm.
rather than just say, right, we don't want to watch them because they're too difficult. That seems to repress that, silence that history.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, if they're just out in the public domain, they have no context, that seems problematic too. But to revisit them and to have commentary that is coming from the position of the people in the film seems a really interesting thing
Mhm.
to take forward into other archive film work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really important to know where we've come from to be able to do better now. Like, as long as there is that context and kind of understanding, yeah, I think it's really
Yes.
important to kind of learn from the past and do better, but also just to
Mm.
show that these children are they're just stimming, like, just let them
Yeah.
kind of exist, and you don't need to analyze them down to the very core.
No, absolutely. And, an academic interpretation of that film is much, much drier.
Mhm.
And I have written about the film, and it's nowhere near as good or as lively as the interpretations that are in Autism Plays itself.
Mhm.
So yeah, it just I think the sheer force of identification that came from each of those respondents of like, yes, I know those children, they're my people, I understand what they're doing, what they want, I understand their frustrations. It was just very straightforward.
Mhm.
um, and yeah, that you get the humor as well as the frustration and pain in the film.
Mhm.
So I think really, really quite lovely, and enlivening. I keep using that word, but it's sort of animating. The film animates me. It sort of goes back to the past and bounces back to the present, I
Mhm.
think.
And do you know if the film will be kind of available sort of publicly at any point to watch?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, it will be. We don't have a date for that yet because it's still, whilst it's doing the festival
Yeah.
circuits, you have to keep it sort of, people will know, out of the public domain.
Mhm.
It may be in the London Film Festival. It's definitely showing at Folkestone Documentary Festival in October.
Wow.
Um, and it will probably have a few more screenings, and then it'll be on our project website, I would think, towards the end of this year, certainly by the beginning of 2025.
Okay, no problem. What I'll do is when it comes out, I will update the show notes so that people can go and watch it when it does come out. Because I
Oh,
feel like
great.
having, obviously, talk to you, I think people are going to want to, see the visuals and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Cool.
sure. There's also a link to a trailer, actually. I'll give you that, so give
Oh yeah, that
some
would be
sort of
good.
some taste of it.
Yeah, that would be good. And I know we were going to kind of touch upon your autism kind of through cinema project, and maybe just, I don't know if you could just kind of give us a sort of overview as to kind of being a principal investigator on it and what that involved.
Mm. Yes, so being a principal investigator was a mixed bag, shall I say, particularly working on a project like this that was planned around a lot of collaboration, but then, of course, the pandemic arrived. But like with all limitations, there are creative ways. It forces you to be creative around that, and having a podcast was one of the things that worked really well for us in
Mhm.
building a community remotely and online. And I think it enabled us to reach autistic audiences internationally. We had listeners in Australia and far afield from that, which was great. So we got all sorts of feedback for the project and input in a way that we hadn't if we just conducted workshops in London and Hastings.
Mhm.
So that was great. But to answer your question of what the project was really, as I was saying at the beginning, thinking about a relationship between these two terms, autism and cinema. And you say that to people, and people come up with sort of classic films. Might be Temple Grandin, might be Rain Man. It might be something more contemporary, like The Terrible Music by Sia. Or all those sort of fictional representations that engage you in a world in which it's as though the character is real, and you sort of forget about the film form, about how it's been shot and staged and constructed and edited. And we were coming from the other direction, which was really to think about our way into it was thinking about how lots of things that are said about cinema are very similar to the things that are said about an autistic apprehension of the world. So, for example, cinema in its earlier days, it was very much um, lauded for its way of photographing the world and showing us things we didn't already see. So, like the wind moving the leaves in the trees, um, the way in which it showed us patterns. So, for example, a camera from a high position documenting crowds, filming crowds moving through a city, you begin to see patterns of behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that resonates with an autistic apprehension of the world, sort of the way in which autistic focus can be like a close-up. It can kind of latch onto something and really want to investigate or immerse in that. It very interested in sensory ways of being involved with the world, and very attached to patterns and rhythms. So we were thinking about, well, there's a lot of interesting overlap. I wonder how we can explore that. So Stephen Eastwood, my collaborator, explored that with a collective that was formed during the course of the project, the Neurocultures Collective, who made a film with him called Stimming Pool, that's also in festivals at the moment, a feature-length kind of experimental fictional documentary form. Hard to know how to describe it. It has a protagonist, but it's also a sequence of scenes written by the different members of the collective that are threaded together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's doing incredibly well, and we'll have a cinema release at the end of the year. So that was one direction, sort of experimental cinema and collaboration. And then for my direction, I've been writing about autism, and I've written a book called Autism and the Empathy Epidemic, which is really trying to reverse the idea that autism is an issue for society broadly, because autistic people aren't empathetic, and really turning it around through Damien Milton's version of autism and empathy, which is, there's a double empathy problem, that autistic people are on the receiving end of those kinds of slurs and pathologizations, when in fact their engagements of the world are just not recognized.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really what the project's been about. It sort of engages with these new theorizations and explorations of autism as a particular sensory form.
Mm-hmm.
The sorts of things that's coming through the work of Anna Stenning, for example, in the UK, an autistic life writing that's very much about nature, and reinvents that genre of nature writing from something that was just kind of considered romantic into something that's very vibrant and really resonates with an autistic apprehension. And also with scholarship in the UK, like Remy Yergo, who is quite a prolific writer on autism and rhetoric. Remy is an autistic scholar who advocates very much for autistic scholarship. And they came and keynoted our conference a year and a half ago at Queen Mary. So that was pretty fabulous.
Okay.
So I think that, does that give you a broad enough
Yeah.
with the project?
Also, it's really fascinating to me that you've also been involved as a podcaster, and kind of had that sort of side of things, and just having that kind of audience as well. I think, yeah, it's always
Yeah.
interesting to hear from other people that have done it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it was a thing, right? When COVID happened,
Yeah.
it was oh, how are people going to speak to each other? How are we going to do this? And podcasting took off, but it was also it for me. It was a really new way of working, and it's informed the way that I teach now, and that it taught me how to think with people. It was like moving in a swarm.
Mm-hmm.
You begin to discuss a film that someone has suggested. We'd all watched it. Someone would introduce it, and then you listen to two or three people talking about it. You say something, and it begins to go in one direction, and then everyone moves in a slightly different direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I really enjoyed that, and it seemed like a very productive way of working that is not at all individualistic. And so I like that, and I would like to do more work like that at the interface of not just different disciplines, but also with different forms of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important. I think disability studies, critical autism studies, absolutely need scholars that are disabled and autistic. But I think it's also important that those subjects don't become siloed. They don't become those communities speaking just to themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
but but there is so much from those disciplines that we need to take up more broadly in academia, and of course more broadly culturally and socially, that it's important that collaborations move across those boundaries as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I'd be keen to understand, are you kind of, what the kind of future holds for you and your research? Like, will you still kind of be focusing on kind of autism, or do you
Mm.
think, like, is that kind of where your kind of interests lie, or are you kind of moving kind of on? How does it work in terms of what you choose to research?
Yeah, good question. Um, I don't know the answer to that right now,
Mm-hmm.
but some of my thoughts are that I am very much still interested in autism and its relationship to cinema, and the history of autism and cinema, how they overlap in medical films. And there are a sequence of Dutch films, actually from the 60s, where there's a study of twins, and they're much longer films with sound, and they don't seem to have been written about at all. But they're very beautiful. There's a sort of study of this one doctor's relationship with one of the twins who's autistic, and it's like it would be writing and working with an object that is good. It's like looking back and it's like, oh, what a beautiful film. So how do you work with something that in fact you think is quite lovely at its origin? So that's a question for me about
Mm-hmm.
what I can do with that. I'm also interested in the overlap between queer histories and autism. I think there's a lot of shared history around things like conversion therapy, for example, and outsiderliness. And as someone who's identified as queer for all of my life, I'm sort of keen to explore some of that medical history too.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it must be really hard to almost like switch off work-wise, because it sounds like you're someone that kind of thinks as they're just kind of existing about potential kind of like films and different kind of crossovers of things. So
Mm,
it must
yeah.
be quite hard trying to switch off as as an academic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true. It is, but you've always got another narrative going on where
Mhm.
you're thinking like, okay, what can I do with this? I think it can be frustrating for people around me sometimes who are not in the world of academia.
Mhm.
So yeah, some limitations for sure, but it's also incredibly enjoyable,
Mhm.
puzzling these things.
Well, thank you so much for spending an hour. I can't believe it's been an hour talking about autism plays itself, and also autism through cinema. And yeah, I will try and link as much as I physically can in the show notes, and keep the show notes updated as to when the actual film goes kind of live. But I will definitely put the trailer link in the show notes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you for a really lovely interview.